I began telling my story a little more than a year ago, and I started with silence and stubbornness and stigma. And then I went on to introduce myself by the names and the labels that I'd been called pretty much all my life: brain damaged, lunatic, crazy Amy. And then a year and a half ago, I broke my silence with an MHA coffee and conversation. And I love the picture that's on the website. It's a thing that says begin. And that's kind of where my journey began in retrospect. But I started then naming my depression and anxiety as my superpower and not my cross to bear. And I spoke of my trauma and the dichotomy of what the world saw versus what I was. The world saw an overachiever, but I was really, in reality, a puddle on the floor most nights. And then I thought, my journey it's done, it's over, but there was still some fear that was a part of me, and I still felt like I was running away from these labels, and stigma was still really much ingrained in me. But with any personal journey, mental wellness or otherwise, there's twists and turns, and my story evolved. And today it's a different story. It's, struggling with mental illness alone is like trying to put together a 1,000-piece puzzle, but you don't have an image to guide you. And, for the past decade, I've listened to these courageous MHA storytellers, and each one, either I recorded them and I listened to them, and each one, I started to recognize a piece of my own puzzle, and an image started to emerge. But I still couldn't really accept, what was going on. And I really couldn't accept my own fear that there's probably something a little bit more wrong with me than depression and anxiety, and I was still running away from my labels. So recently, the last story I told was a visit to my OBGYN, which was my primary care physician, and she had been prescribing me antidepressants and anti-anxiety medicine for decades. And this time was different because they gave me a mental health screening. I guess I was in such a crisis mode when I showed up that this was my first mental health screening. And after I answered those questions honestly, she immediately referred me to a psychiatrist. So 8 months later, I finally had an appointment with a psychiatrist, and I had to start taking a myriad of tests, and those screening questions on the MHA website, those kind of like that. I had to go through each one of those. And something I've come to realize, being married to an engineer and a person that's known me for 25 years, is that my perception of how well I'm maintaining or managing my mental health is a lot different than his. And truth be told, I've always been on a hair trigger. I'm always tired. My ups and downs are detrimental to myself and those around me. But I just couldn't see it, probably because I've lived my whole life in survival mode since I was about 15. Again, afraid of those labels that I'd been called all of my life, and afraid that the labels were chasing me down almost. So I started answering these screening questions, these diagnostic tools, and I kind of began to see a pattern. And I debated on how honest to answer the questions because I kind of knew what was coming. I kind of knew that my medical records were about to change forever, and this fear of like being labeled permanently was gonna be in a permanent marker instead of in pencil. But it was being solidified with each question I answered honestly. And I started to recognize my fear. And on Um, wow, I didn't think this was going to be so hard. um, but on October 21st, I saw the doctor over telecast or whatever, and she began to go over the results of all these tests. And sure enough, after 40 minutes and rather nonchalantly, this complete stranger told me that I had bipolar disorder and hypervigilance and PTSD, which fueled my depression and anxiety. So she told me to take these pills and come back to her in 30 days. And Andy, I have to agree with your opening statements. Medication is something that I've completely ran away from my entire life. Kind of taking them when and wherever I wanted to, kind of being my own doctor in terms of my antidepressants and stuff. But she said that you need to have these mood stabilizers and 50 milligrams and you'll be good to go. And I was like, oh no, that's not gonna work. So a bit nonchalantly, or non-ceremoniously, my chart was updated, and the first thing I told my husband was, it's official, I'm crazy. And the relief wasn't immediate, but I did finally have a diagnosis. Something I'd always secretly wished that I would have been diagnosed with a physical injury, something that would have explained my behavior and explained my pain. And, you know, I used to wish that I had cancer or AIDS or something, you know, in the 80s and 90s. But I don't know if you can imagine a never-ending cycle of 2 weeks you feel really great, and then you self-sabotage and you have 2 weeks of lows, and then it's followed by shame and guilt and substance use. But that's kind of been my life up until now. And it's like, duh, of course you're bipolar, and of course, you know, that answers a whole lot of questions. And it kind of started to make me feel better. And I kind of came out from underneath that blanket of shame. So our stories are constantly evolving. And I can tell you that I feel so much better now. It's been about 60 days, and I am going to the gym every morning. I'm like waking up and not struggling to get out of bed. I'm like actually getting out of bed, excited. And so the medication is working and the diagnosis is working. And, you know, my husband always says, happiness is a really big deal. And that was always hard for me to hear because I spent all my days struggling to survive depression and anxiety. But now I'm understanding what he meant. Happiness really is a big deal. And, you know, Jim talked about recovery, and recovery looks so different to those with a mental health diagnosis. Recovery is possible, but, you know, recovery is getting out of bed in the morning, you know, not, you know, and being able to speak about this and just going to lunch with friends instead of being isolated. That's kind of recovery for us. And recovery for me is now finding like this renewed sense of self, you know, coming out from underneath the shame and accepting the diagnosis that I've ran for decades. And I will say that recovery is like finally seeing an image to the 1,000-piece puzzle. And the campaign that the MHA started over 10 years ago, Breaking Stigma, one conversation at a time, it works. I mean, it's taken me 10 years, but it absolutely works. Hearing these stories, and if it hadn't have been for these conversations, and the recovery journey of all of these MHA storytellers, then I would still be getting over it. Like everybody's tells us to do if we're depressed. Oh, just get over it. And getting over it is not a treatment plan. And it's not a recovery mantra. You know, you have to get through it. And with the MHA and them just normalizing the conversation, like Kathy says, they made me understand that a mental health diagnosis is like a physical health diagnosis, in that you can get treatment and you can get better, and recovery is possible. And I will say that the first person I called was Andrea when I got this news. And it was kind of like I finally feel like I belong to a group or whatever. So the work that the MHA does is life-changing and life-altering, and the work that the MHA storytellers do, like the coffee cup said in the picture, like begin, and that's all you have to do is begin. And beginning for me was listening to these conversations and normalizing the diagnosis and feeling that mental health is like physical health. And yeah, I'm so grateful for the work that the MHA does and for being involved for the past 10 years. So with that, thanks guys for listening. You guys are the first people that, you know, I've told all this stuff to. So yay, breaking silence. So here we go. So this is what bipolar looks like, I guess. So, not so bad.